The list arrived without ceremony. No press conference, no diplomatic preamble, no handshake photo. Just 5 demands, delivered through the office of U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, addressed to a country that Washington had spent decades assuming would comply. And for a moment, barely 24 hours, the world waited to see what Mark Carney would do. Then came the answer. Not a counteroffer, not a request for clarification, not the softened, hedged, carefully worded diplomatic language that Ottawa has deployed in situations like this for 40 years. Just a flat, unambiguous rejection. All 5, at once. And that single decision, that refusal to blink, quietly transformed what Washington expected to be a routine trade review into the most consequential economic confrontation North America has seen in a generation. The backdrop matters. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA, entered into force on July 1, 2020. It was built with a structural checkpoint. 6 years in, all 3 parties must declare whether they want to extend the deal for another 16 years, renegotiate its terms, or walk away. That deadline is July 1, 2026, 70 days from now. And because of what is sitting inside those 70 days, billions of dollars in cross-border supply chains, 3.5 million barrels of oil flowing south every single day, hundreds of thousands of jobs strapped to the outcome, the pressure in the room is unlike anything since NAFTA itself was being written. Washington came in expecting deference. Ottawa came in with something it has never quite had before, prepared leverage and the political will to use it. We know this because of what the demands themselves reveal, not just about what Washington wants, but about what it fears losing. The first demand targeted dairy, the second targeted digital media, the third targeted government procurement, the fourth targeted alcohol, the fifth targeted energy policy. And every single one of those 5 pressure points, when you examine what Canada had already done before the demands were even formalized, had been quietly hardened into policy, legislation, or structural reality months in advance. This was not a reactive defense. This was a prepared position. The question now is whether Washington understands what it is actually dealing with, or whether it will keep pushing in a direction that accelerates the very outcome it is trying to prevent. Let's start with dairy, because it is the demand that reveals the most about Washington's fundamental miscalculation. American agricultural producers have argued for years that Canada's supply management system is protectionist, and on paper, the numbers look alarming. Tariffs between 200 and 298% on dairy imports beyond fixed quotas. Washington framed this as an unfair barrier to American competition. But here is what that framing gets wrong. Canada's supply management system is not a loophole. It is not a relic. It is a deliberately constructed architecture that stabilizes domestic production and protects tens of thousands of family farms, particularly in Quebec, where the system is woven into the regional economy in ways that go far beyond trade policy. And before Washington could even formalize its dairy demand, Canada had already passed legislation that permanently protects supply management from negotiation. The law now prevents any Canadian government from conceding on this point, regardless of political will. What used to be a bargaining chip has been transformed into a constitutional near constant. Washington asked for something that, legally, Canada can no longer give. The digital media dispute runs even deeper, because it is not just about money, it is about identity. Canada's Online Streaming Act and Online News Act require platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube to reinvest a portion of their Canadian revenue into local content and to compensate publishers for the use of Canadian journalism. Washington called these laws discriminatory against American tech firms. Ottawa called them essential to cultural survival in a market dominated by the world's largest media machine. Both descriptions are accurate, and that is precisely why the conflict is so intractable. Because the debate is not about fairness in the abstract. It is about who controls what Canadians watch, read, and are told, and who profits from it. The revenue flows redirected by these laws are measured in billions. The platforms affected have enormous lobbying power in Washington, and yet Canada did not walk these policies back. It defended them as structural, non-negotiable, and rooted in sovereignty. Then comes procurement. This is the demand that collapsed fastest under its own logic. Washington accused Canadian provinces, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, of favoring domestic suppliers in government contracts and demanded equal access for American companies. But the United States enforces Buy American provisions across virtually every category of federal spending: infrastructure, defense, manufacturing, agriculture. The very trade representative making the procurement demand operates within a government that tells foreign companies they cannot bid on hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. contracts. Carney's refusal here required almost no explanation. You cannot demand that your trading partner abandon domestic preference while maintaining it yourself. The argument does not survive contact with its own mirror. The alcohol dispute looks small by comparison, but it reveals something important about the sequencing of this entire conflict. Several Canadian provinces, including Ontario through the LCBO, pulled American beer and wine from their shelves, and Washington demanded those bans be lifted. But here is the problem with that demand. The bans were put in place as a direct response to U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. They were retaliatory measures triggered by American aggression. Asking Canada to remove the retaliatory bans while leaving the original tariffs in place is not negotiation. It is capitulation dressed up as a demand. Ottawa recognized it immediately and treated it accordingly. Now here is what every other outlet is missing. The most revealing demand on Washington's list was not what was included. It was what was conspicuously, almost strategically absent: automobiles. The most economically critical, the most deeply integrated, the most mutually dependent sector in the entire North American economy, and Washington barely touched it in its formal demands. And the reason for that tells you everything about the real balance of power underneath this standoff. The North American auto industry does not operate as a Canadian industry and an American industry running side by side. It operates as a single continental system. Canadian factories produce components that cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is assembled in Michigan or Ohio. American plants supply engines that go into vehicles built in Windsor and Oshawa. This network saves tens of billions of dollars annually through efficiency and scale. And when you impose tariffs on that system, as Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum already have, you do not hurt one side and spare the other. You fracture the whole machine. American manufacturers like Ford and GM have already warned about the consequences. That is why when Carney's team explained to Congress just how interconnected these supply chains are, the response in the room was not skepticism. It was recognition. And that recognition is the reason automobiles were left off the demand list. Washington knows that pushing too hard in that sector risks destabilizing companies that are already under pressure, and companies that vote with their lobbying dollars in ways that reach directly into the Oval Office. But let me translate what that actually means for you. If the auto supply chain gets genuinely disrupted, not in theory, not on a trade briefing, but in practice, the cost does not land on a spreadsheet in Ottawa or Washington. It lands on the assembly line worker in Brampton who gets a 2-week suspension notice. It lands on the supplier in Toledo who finds out his parts order has been canceled because the Canadian factory that was buying them now costs too much to supply. It lands on the dealership in Detroit that cannot get inventory because production has slowed. These are not hypotheticals. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and vehicles have already strained the system. The industry has already absorbed real pain, and every executive in the sector is now privately telling the administration the same thing. We need stability, not escalation. That pressure from within the industrial base is the invisible third party at the negotiating table, and it is working in Canada's favor. Here is the expert consensus. Patrick LeBlanc of the University of Ottawa, one of the country's most respected trade scholars, described Washington's posture in stark terms, saying the U.S. approach amounted to putting a gun to Canada's head and demanding compliance. But he also noted that this framing operates inside a framework that treats asymmetry as the only relevant variable, and that asymmetry is no longer the full story. Steve Verheuel, who personally drafted CUSMA during Trump's first term and served as Canada's chief trade negotiator through 2021, made a statement at a Bank of Montreal panel on April 8th that stopped a lot of people in the room. He said simply that time is on Canada's side, that the pressures building inside the American economy, from tariff-driven inflation, from supply chain disruption, from industrial lobbying, from the legal collapse of IEPA authority, are mounting faster than Washington can manage them. And the longer Canada holds its position without collapsing, the more those pressures force a recalibration from the American side. And when Canada's own top CUSMA negotiator, Janice Charette, described the July 1 deadline not as a cliff, but as a checkpoint, she was signaling something important. Ottawa is not panicking. And in this negotiation, the side that is not panicking holds the advantage. Now let's be fair. The counter-argument deserves to be heard clearly because it is not weak. 76% of Canada's goods exports in 2025 went to the United States. Even after a year of diversification efforts, that number, which fell to its lowest level since the early 1980s, still sits at over 70%. That is a structural dependency that does not dissolve through rhetoric or advisory committees. Critics, including conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, have argued that Carney is playing for time without a plan, that 5 months of stalled negotiations while Mexico moves ahead, while the July deadline approaches, while Canadian workers in steel and lumber and autos remain under tariff pressure, is not strategy. It is drift. Former Canadian ambassadors, trade veterans, and business leaders who know Washington intimately have warned that the Americans perceive Canada as unwilling to come to the table. And a country that is perceived as unwilling to negotiate is not maximizing leverage. It is risking isolation. These are serious arguments. They come from serious people who have spent their careers understanding exactly what is at stake. But here is the structural counterpoint that cuts through the criticism. Canada already has an agreement in place. CUSMA is in force. The status quo, imperfect, tariff-burdened, strained as it is, still benefits both sides. Washington cannot simply blow it up without blowing up $960 billion in annual U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico, a number Greer himself cited in congressional testimony. It cannot replace Canadian heavy sour crude on refinery timelines that span decades. It cannot rebuild in 18 months the supply chain architecture that took 30 years to construct. The asymmetry is real, but it does not run in one direction. And Carney's strategy, however agonizing it looks from the outside, appears to be built around one core insight. The side with more to lose in a short-term disruption is not necessarily the side with less leverage over the long-term outcome. And then there is the move that changed the geometry of this entire standoff: Carney's pivot toward China. Targeted agreements on canola, electric vehicles, and agricultural exports created what he called friendly nation tariffs with Beijing. Not a free trade deal, but enough to reopen markets that had been closed. Canada's exports outside the United States jumped 17% year over year in the 12 months ending January 2026. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural shift in trade flows beginning to register in the actual data. When Trump initially praised the Beijing outreach and then reversed course, threatening 100% tariffs if Canada became a transshipment route for Chinese goods, Ottawa responded with immediate clarification. No free trade agreement was being pursued. No existing CUSMA clauses were being violated. And that response was later confirmed directly in talks between Dominic LeBlanc and Greer. But the deeper message had already been sent. Canada is not negotiating from a single axis anymore. Every new export channel, every reopened market, every bilateral arrangement with a European or Indo-Pacific partner reduces the gravitational pull of American dependency. And Washington understands this, even if it does not say so. The critical minerals dimension is the one that will define the next decade, and almost no one is covering it with the seriousness it deserves. Canada holds some of the world's most significant deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth elements, the raw materials that underpin electric vehicles, battery storage, semiconductors, and the artificial intelligence infrastructure that the United States has declared a national priority. Washington wants access. American clean energy policy, American AI investment, American defense industrial strategy, all of it runs through supply chains that depend on what sits in Canadian rock. And Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand made clear that Canada is not prepared to sign a standalone critical minerals deal with the United States outside of the CUSMA review. The government wants to keep it as a bargaining chip. A $28 billion F-35 purchase, 88 fighter jets that Canada has already partially committed to, is also sitting on the table, with Ottawa publicly reconsidering whether to complete the order. These are not abstract leverage points. They are concrete, measurable, and deeply consequential for American defense contractors who have their own lines to the administration. The leverage isn't just about current trade flows. It is about future dependencies that are only beginning to crystallize. Now zoom out to the personal stakes, because this standoff is not abstract. If you work in Canadian steel, you have been living under Section 232 tariffs for over a year. Your employer has been absorbing costs or passing them to buyers. The uncertainty about what happens on July 1 is not a policy question for you. It is a question about whether the plant runs next quarter. If you own a small business that imports American inputs, you have spent a year navigating tariff remissions, temporary exemptions, and a compliance landscape that changes with social media posts from a president who has called CUSMA irrelevant in one breath and essential in the next. If you heat your home in New England with Canadian electricity, and during winter peaks millions do, you are part of an energy dependency that the people negotiating this deal are treating as a footnote when it is actually a load-bearing wall. And if you are a dairy farmer in Quebec, the prospect that your government's supply management system could be surrendered in negotiations is not a theoretical concern. It is an existential one. That is what the 5 demands actually represent. When you strip away the trade briefing language, a set of choices about whose economy gets protected, whose industry gets sacrificed, and whose workers absorb the cost of decisions made in rooms they will never enter. At the macro level, the stakes are even harder to overstate, because what is being negotiated is not just a trade agreement. It is a question about the architecture of North American economic sovereignty for the next 16 years. If CUSMA is extended in something close to its current form, with tariff relief and a durable framework, the message to every business planning a cross-border investment is, stability is possible. Invest. If it collapses into annual reviews, stretching uncertainty all the way to 2036, the message is the opposite. And Carney's $1 trillion investment target by 2030, his central economic promise to Canadians, depends entirely on the signal that comes out of the July review. Business leaders and economists have been explicit about this. Without CUSMA certainty, that investment target does not materialize. The deal is not just about trade. It is about whether Canada can position itself as a destination for the capital flows that will define the next phase of the global economy. And globally, the signal Canada is sending matters beyond its own borders. When Carney stood before the World Economic Forum in Davos and warned that middle powers which fail to assert themselves risk becoming subordinate to larger economies, when he delivered the line that countries not seated at the table end up on the menu, the audience was not only Canadian. It was the European Union, anxious about economic coercion. It was the Indo-Pacific economies recalibrating around American unpredictability. It was every government watching to see whether a country as deeply integrated with the United States as Canada could actually hold a line. Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, called it virtue signaling, but the broader global reaction suggested something else entirely. Canada was not posturing. It was positioning, trying to join a wider coalition of economies that want rules-based trade to survive the current era of great power disruption. Whether that positioning succeeds depends on what happens in the next 70 days. Here are the deadlines you need to watch. April 27, 2026. Carney's new 24-member advisory committee on Canada-U.S. economic relations holds its first meeting, chaired by Dominic LeBlanc. This is the formal start of Canada's coordinated negotiating posture. What emerges from that room will shape every position Ottawa takes going forward. The week of May 25th, U.S. and Mexico hold their first official bilateral CUSMA negotiating round in Mexico City. This is the moment Canada either gets pulled back into active talks or risks watching the trilateral framework begin to fracture into a bilateral one. A segmented deal, separate agreements with Canada and Mexico, is Jameson Greer's stated preference. It would let Washington play the two countries against each other. It would reduce Canada's leverage, and it would mark the most significant structural change to North American trade governance since NAFTA was signed. July 1, 2026, the review deadline. 3 outcomes are possible: a full extension for 16 more years, a signal of withdrawal that triggers expiration by 2036, or a shift to annual reviews, a limbo that preserves the agreement's existence while allowing its terms to be relitigated every 12 months until one side blinks or breaks. Each of those outcomes sends a different signal to markets, to investors, to workers, and to every government watching from outside the continent. The next 70 days matter more than the next 70 news cycles, because what gets filed, said, or decided in that window will either hold this story in place or blow it wide open. Here is the human truth at the center of all of this. Canada has spent 40 years building a relationship with the United States on the assumption that deep integration meant mutual dependence, and that mutual dependence meant mutual respect. That assumption has been shattered, not gradually, not ambiguously, but explicitly, by a president who called CUSMA irrelevant, while his trade representative cited $960 billion in American exports under the deal, by an administration that demanded Canada remove retaliatory tariffs without removing the original ones that triggered them, by a negotiating posture that a former Canadian diplomat described simply as asking for an entry fee just to walk into the room. And the workers, the farmers, the small business owners, the communities built around cross-border supply chains, they are the ones who will pay the price if this standoff goes wrong. They are already paying it. The tariffs on steel and aluminum are not hypothetical. The lumber tariffs, 50% on cabinets and vanities as of January 1st, 2026, are not hypothetical. The uncertainty freezing investment decisions is not hypothetical. It is the economic weather that millions of Canadians are living in right now, every day, while the negotiations inch forward and the calendar counts down toward July. What makes Canada's position so historically unusual is not the defiance. It is the preparation behind the defiance. The legislation locking supply management in place, the digital content laws defended as non-negotiable, the critical minerals held back from a standalone deal, the F-35 purchase left unresolved, the China pivot generating real export data, the advisory committee launched with cross-partisan membership, including former conservative leaders and premiers, sending the message that this is not partisan politics. This is national strategy. None of these moves happened overnight. They were assembled piece by piece into a negotiating structure that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness, but looks, from the inside, like architecture. And the real question now, the question that will be answered over the next 70 days, is whether that architecture holds. Whether the leverage Canada has built through diversification, legislation, and strategic patience can be converted into a durable agreement that actually removes the tariff pressure from its workers and its industries. Or whether the clock runs out before either side finds the language to close the gap.